You're now listening to episode 133 of the Real Estate CPA Podcast.
Your source for all things real estate, accounting, and tax. Here we reveal our secrets that can save you thousands in taxes, streamline your accounting process, and help grow your business. Stay tuned to hear insightful interviews with industry experts, successful real estate investors, and current clients on what strategies they use to grow their business and how they steer clear of Uncle Sam.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. Brandon Hall and Tom Costelli joined here with Johnny Merritt, a partner at Hajjar Peters LLP. Johnny has over 3 decades of experience in complex corporate and real estate matters. He has been a transactional attorney for more than 20 years, concentrating on ongoing business operations, organizational structuring, mergers and acquisitions, as well as real estate purchases, sales, and development. In today's episode, we discuss Series LLCs in the state of Texas, why you should work with an attorney for entity structuring rather than doing it yourself, how Texas real estate market has been impacted by COVID-19, lease agreements, and much more. Before we dive right into today's episode, we did want to remind everybody about our Tax Smart Real Estate Investor Facebook community. It's the one-stop shop for real estate investors to learn about tax strategies and stay up to date on all the tax law changes. With nearly 650 members and counting, there are a ton of conversations taking place right now. Join today by visiting www.facebook.com/groups/taxsmartinvestors or by following the link in the show notes below, or you can just search us on Facebook. I'm sure we'll pop right up. We're looking forward to seeing you in there, but for now, we're going to jump right into today's episode. John, thanks so much for taking time to come on the show today. Would you be able to give our listeners a little information on your background and your work?
Sure. You're talking to Johnny Merritt. I'm an attorney in Austin, Texas. I grew up on a farm and ranch in West Texas. Grew up on a horse. I never thought that I would do anything but be on a ranch. And in fact, my father, who was born in 1916, told me that you should never trust a man with soft hands. And so as I became an attorney, I always dreaded kind of shaking his hand as he stuck out his hand to me. But for the last about 35 years, I have practiced law. I graduated long before you guys were born from law school in the savings and loan crisis. All I ever wanted to do was real estate and corporate work. But you, as I've told many law school classes that I've spoken to, you do what comes in the door. And frankly, the FSLIC, the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation, came into an office in Amarillo, Texas, and said, we would like you guys to sue officers and directors all over the nation. And so that's what I did for 10 years is worked in the savings and loan crisis in litigation, which sounds pretty exciting unless you're a young attorney from what some attorneys would believe is a place where no good attorney would come from, and that's from a little town in West Texas. After 10 years, I couldn't stand it anymore. So about the latter part of the 90s, I went full time in transactional law, and as I said, for the last 25 years or so, I've handled all kinds of real estate, all kinds of corporate work. Have worked as essentially general counsel. Because of my experience with officers and directors, I've been asked to serve as general counsel, outside general counsel for several entities. And so I've been very blessed to do what I love to do, and will continue almost 60 and have no interest in slowing down because I love so much what I do.
That's always good to hear. I think the good thing about being an attorney or being, an accountant is you could probably work until it's over if you wanted to. I mean, why not, right? That's the way I always look at it. I'll never have to actually really retire.
And my wife's a CPA, so I've got to tell you a story because I know both of you are CPAs. When I was doing the SNL, the savings and loan crisis, I was actually deposing directors, and I was asking them about other directors to find if they fulfilled their fiduciary duties. This was in Dallas for this specific deposition. And I asked about, and I can't remember, asked one director about another director. The director I was asking about was a CPA. And so I asked this director about this CPA as a director, and I said, tell me about, and Thomas, I'll just pick on you. I said, tell me about Thomas. And he shook his head and said, well, he's a CPA. And I said, well, would you tell the judge and jury what you mean by that? And he says, he has no personality at all. So I went home and called my wife and I said, honey, listen, I know your problem. It's sworn testimony. You have no, and it went over just about as well with her as it did with you guys. So, but true story.
Yeah. Look, I've heard that before. People have told me that before. Like, people have told me before. There's no way that you're an accountant. So I mean, I would take offense for that if it wasn't for those instances. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I hear you. I hear you there. Now kind of shifting back to like the the real estate space a little bit. When it comes to entity structuring asset protection for commercial real estate, like office, industrial, multifamily, retail, that type of stuff. What do you, how do you normally see? What are some common entity structures you see real estate investors use?
Well, by far, the LLC is the way to go. In fact, my own real estate holdings, that's how I own my own real estate is through, except for my home, that Texas has very good homestead laws. And so very broad homestead laws, but limited liability corporation is 90% of what we do. There used to be an advantage in Texas to do a limited partnership because of franchise taxes, but that advantage went away. So we use LLCs quite a bit. We'll use either regular LLCs or even series LLCs, where you can structure different deals and different investments with different investors and limit liability for different series within a series LLC. So we use that quite a bit. So it's really important. It's certainly not C Corp. I had a client very early on who came to me and had an attorney who'd said his father had set up a C Corp, and bless his heart, there was tax problems. So certainly not a C Corp, but I do like the limited liability of a LLC.
Yeah. Also, I just want to jump in there and say that S corps as well. I could tell you from experience working with multiple clients at this point, you don't want to put rental properties in S corporation. Generally speaking, if you can
Yes.
avoid it, it does cause a ton of succession planning, estate planning issues, restructuring problems. If you just want to restructure your portfolio for whatever reason, generally speaking, you want to avoid that. And if you follow that piece of advice, I might have just saved you several thousands of dollars in attorney and accounting fees just by not putting your rental properties in the S corporation. But John, I did want to circle back to what you had said about the series LLCs, and we know in a state like Texas, series LLCs are part of the state law and are very I guess airtight in a sense in the state. But sometimes we speak to clients or speak to attorneys that are working with our clients when they're investing across state lines, or perhaps don't invest in a state that recognize the Series LLC, that there could be issues, when dealing with issues across state lines. Would you be able to speak to that for a second?
Well, yes. I mean, we've got to be very careful to make sure that whatever entity we're recommending works well within the state that we're operating in. The fortunate thing for me is that the real estate is so hot in where I'm located that most of my practice is limited to Texas. But we've done some work in Colorado just recently, and New Mexico, of course. But you're right. I mean, let me tell you this: being married to a CPA and then having practiced in the real estate market for 25 years, one thing that, and I'll say this several times relating to investing in real estate, stay in your lane. And so if you're representing a client that's purchasing land, for instance, in New York or in North Carolina, you'll be very well advised to do two things. One is to have a partner, of a law partner, if you will. And when I say that, I don't mean from a formal sense. I mean contact an attorney in North Carolina or New York, and also develop a great relationship with that client's CPA. And so stay in your lane is important.
That's good advice, and especially with the local attorneys. I found that usually when you're working in real estate, since it's a very local business, you do want to have a local attorney, on your team in the states you're doing business, just to make sure you're not running afoul of any of that the specific state rules, regulations, laws, etc. As it relates to that. This is my experience, though.
I think
And
that's absolutely correct. I think
okay,
that's great advice that you're giving your clients.
can I throw something in, or throw a question in here, kind of
Please.
following up on that? And I understand that most of your clients are in Texas, so I don't know if you'll be able to answer this or not. But what should people be watching out for whenever they, if like I go online and I Google efficient entity setup or something, and that brings me to Series LLCs? I mean, what do I need to be aware of as a consumer? What questions do I need to be asking the attorney? And just because like clients are all over the place, right? So somebody from California could see, oh, this Series LLC thing works really well, set it up, and then only later figure out that California does not recognize Series LLCs and will tax each one of those LLCs as a completely separate LLC. So how do you prevent yourself, maybe even as a consumer, how do you prevent yourself from falling into a trap simply because you didn't know what questions to ask?
Brandon, this will sound very self-serving, and I don't mean it that way. But Series LLCs are really newly developed entities, and even for the experienced real estate investor, even in an experienced real estate investor with me in Texas, it's good to work with an attorney. It's good to have your attorney involved, your CPA involved, and because it's very critical how they're set up and how they're operated. So I certainly Series LLC would not be the type of entity that I would recommend that any client, and I don't mean this self-serving. I mean it very honestly and sincerely. It's not the type of entity that you want to use a form document and not have professional CPA and legal advice. So I'd say that it's a mechanism where you can avoid creating multiple LLCs, which we used to do in the past. But at the same time, you've got to act with care, because there's, as I'm sure you guys have seen, businessmen are in a hurry. We're all in a hurry. And so the thing that we often see is you don't take care of you don't dot the I's and cross the T's. And what a softball answer. I'm sorry for that, but it's just the truth. Is you need to be working with a counsel and a CPA that you trust.
So let's say that I do work with counsel that says Series LLCs work in California. And we know that they don't, because we interviewed Brian Chow a couple episodes ago, and we asked him about Series LLCs in California, and he's an attorney, and he was like, no, they don't work in California. But let's say that you're working with counsel that says, oh yeah, Series LLCs will work in California. I mean, what do you say to something like that? Like if the consumer isn't aware. I guess I don't really know where I'm going with this question. I guess I'm just kind of asking, like, what are your thoughts on people that push the cross state stuff but don't actually specialize in that state?
Well, let me tell you that one matter that I've handled in the last year, frankly, was a very simple real estate transaction in Texas that was handled by a Texas attorney. And it was a residential. I don't do much residential. I do mostly commercial. But this specific attorney used a contract for deed, which is permissible under Texas law. But the Texas legislature has created lots and lots and lots of reporting requirements. And so I don't want to use the M word, the malpractice word, really, but it was a big mistake. And I say that because you got to make sure. Your question. I have a client who's investing in California. I call a California attorney and they tell me, well, sure, you can do an LLC in California. Well, that's my fault, because I haven't vetted that attorney well enough. But it's for clients, be careful. I mean, be careful. Look at the websites of the CPAs you're thinking about, you're considering hiring. Look at the websites of the attorneys. perhaps even, call some of the references to see if it's just glowing remarks. We can't be too careful, because in that instance, we were able to resolve that, but it was very expensive to do so, and was totally unnecessary.
I guess that's more of where I was going with the question was, okay, you find an attorney that says, yeah, Series LLCs work in California. But that attorney does not live in California, and maybe they live in Ohio or North Carolina or Georgia or wherever. But they go, yeah, Series LLCs, we're going to set it up and it's going to work in California. I guess my question is, do they just know something that other attorneys don't, or is it that potential malpractice thing? And maybe it's a toss up per situation. Maybe that's a super tough question to answer, but I think you're right.
It is, Brandon.
Here's what I did, Mr. Klein. I called the California attorney up. Here's what they said, and I'm calling another one or something just to check, or I don't know.
Listen, I appreciate you raising the question, because I have no idea. I didn't know that California didn't recognize LLCs, and so.
Well, don't take our word for it. We're not attorneys, right?
In
our swim lane.
That was going to be my point. It's a scary thought, because. What's true of consumers is also true of me. If one of my important clients is going to invest in a parcel of property in California, perhaps we could use, again, I don't know what the California law is, but I like Texas LLCs. I like Texas entities, because the Texas legislature has caught up to Delaware, in my opinion, and has made entities just about as good here. I know how they operate. And so, but listen, I need to associate with a California attorney to figure out, have I just screwed my client? And that's really important. Great question, Brandon. Gosh, I'm learning more from you guys that you guys are going to learn from me, which is typical, frankly.
Well, I think that you're right on the money, and it's just a lot of the questions that even we get. I mean, we have to consult with a lot of different people before we can really give the client an answer. And I think sometimes clients don't understand that fact.
Well, and I reviewed your website. Very impressive, by the way, even for an old guy who's having to get used to websites. But one thing that you guys talk about, a team approach, and talk about using people who can help your clients. And I love that. I mean, you've got to do that. In fact, I'm a little more of a generalist than you guys are, but so that's even more important for me. But even as specialists in the real estate market, you guys talk about how you have a team that helps people. And I love that. Well done.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we appreciate that, but it's a lot of work. And I think that clients sometimes just don't understand like all the back end work that goes into trying to get the right answer for somebody. And I mean, I can tell you, we were recently going up against a large accounting firm, top 10 accounting firm, because our client was stuck in the middle of their advice and our advice ended up being correct. But this big accounting firm comes back, and I'm like sitting here going, crap, man, have we been giving people bad advice this entire time? And it's just like that type of stuff always happens though in the tax world. I'm sure it's the same thing in the legal world, where you read something, you get taught something, you look at it one way, and then it takes some repetitions to figure out, oops, that actually wasn't necessarily. And so then you learn, like we've learned, we're going to talk to a ton of different professionals out there to figure out what we're not seeing before we go back and start like really pounding advice on any one thing. Like real estate professional status is something we talk about every single time, almost every single podcast. Well, there's a lot of people that don't understand it, and we've learned it simply by talking to a lot of different professionals and a lot of repetitions. And now we feel like we are probably the most well-versed in it, if not at the top of that list in the country. But it takes a lot of time and a lot of repetitions, and it takes relying on a lot of other professionals and getting a lot of different feedback and opinions.
Brandon, you learn from every podcast, but that's the point. One thing that I hadn't thought about until I reviewed your website is how you guys are learning from your podcast, from talking to people. And what a great, that just hadn't occurred to me. Well done again.
Yeah, but before I go into the next question, I'll just say that to your point, podcast is an excellent way to get like an informal education. I learned like half of the multifamily investing world just through listening to podcasts, and then when I went to apply it in practice, it was all most of it was all right. Like so, it's definitely possible to get like a good informal education these days
Yeah,
through
and Thomas,
podcasts.
that's new to me because my law professor back in the 80s said had God intended the law to be on computer, he'd have put it there. And we spent one day studying how to do computer research, and now that's all we do. So I'm trying to get into the 21st century here.
Yeah, and speaking about getting into new things, we are in a new year. We're only, as of this recording, on the 11th day of January, 2021. And we did COVID's not entirely behind us, but we did want to ask, how did the Texas real estate landscape change, as a result of COVID?
Gosh, I thought this was just going to be less than an hour, but I will I'll cancel my dinner plans. And that's particularly true for an old school guy like me. I mean, things have been, we've had recessions, we've had ups and downs, but we've never had anything like COVID. We've never had anything where the condos in downtown Austin are the hottest thing, and then a week later, people are trying to make a mass exodus to the country. We've never had retail strip shopping centers with real expensive women's clothing or men's apparel that now is dragging down the shopping center, as opposed to the service provider, that is a nail salon or a cleaners. We've never had warehouses in rural areas as the sexiest investment that you can make. And then after that, I would say that we're thinking that the condo market in downtown Austin is hurting, but it's not. And so I could go in, tell me if you want me to go into more specifics, but it's turned its real estate on its head and quickly, and then it's changing back quickly in some respects. But if you'd like me to talk more specifically about different areas of real estate, I'm happy to do that, or I'll delay and you just tell me what you want.
Yeah, so maybe like if we looked at, like, I know that I guess here's a good way to look at to ask it, specifically for retail, retail and office. How have you seen retail and office be affected by COVID? In
well, retail is it's interesting, the food the grocery, not restaurant, but the grocery industry and home goods are really hot. Apparel is not doing well. Dining is not doing well. And again, if you think about retail from a historical standpoint, that's a flip. Typically, it would be the nice restaurants or the nice clothing stores that are carrying that retail shopping strip, and that's not true anymore. So those are the greatest issues from a retail standpoint.
Have you seen any like major opportunities? Like, I guess like the question would be, what are the opportunities that you're seeing, for investors that are being created by COVID? Like, is there a certain like asset class that, people should be looking to invest in right now, or should be considering rather? I mean, I know we're not giving investment advice necessarily, but
I guess I'd say stay in my lane. So I'm not a great investment advisor, and some of my own real estate investments will show that. But what I would say is what I'm seeing a bunch of is, particularly in some of the smaller towns, is we're seeing some of these Dollar General, some of these more general grocery or food type buildings that are available to be purchased with triple net, long-term triple net leases. And we're seeing a lot of those move. In that regard, we're seeing a lot of businesses who are focused on their capital. And so they're thinking, we would be better off in allocating our capital, not so much in real estate, because that's not what our core business is, and invest our capital in our core business and sell our real estate. And to the extent that you can find a real property that works for you, that you can afford, where you can secure a long-term tenant that will serve you well, there's some real opportunities out there. And in fact, I'd say on that second one, I've seen some really good deals. I've seen some auction property where very significant businesses have sold some of their real estate in the best way. They had enough real estate to sell that they did it in an auction standpoint, which was fine for them. But some people were able to pick up some pretty good deals. And if you talk to really successful real estate investors, what you find is now's the time. I say that on the property that's down, perhaps now is the time to invest. And I think what's driving Austin and the world, frankly, the nation, with residential real estate is interest rates are so good. And so you can afford to spend more money because the real cost over that 15 years or 10 years or 5 years or 30 years is not that much greater.
Yeah, no, I definitely seen the same thing on the residential side. A tremendous amount of tremendous amount of demand for real estate as a result of that interest rate. And I can just speak from friends and family, and not only that, but just from investors we work with. That's definitely dead on accurate. Kind of like switching gears just a tad to like the side of like the legal documents as a result of COVID, like the lease agreements, for example. With the eviction moratoriums and all these different things that have been going on, we've heard different things about how people have been structuring their leases to better combat COVID and make sure they're not stuck holding the bag. Can you speak to that a little bit?
And before you do, I want to throw in something else. I know when COVID was first breaking out, everybody was looking at their leases for, and I forget what the legal term is, but it's the act of God, the out.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that. What's that?
Majeure. Force majeure.
Force majeure. That's right. So talk a little bit about that too. Will leases in the future very clearly have a force majeure clause?
Well, so let me address that clause first. That was a clause that, again, for 25 years, I've included in most contracts, kind of because I thought it was lawyer-like to do so. It's just one of those things that you think, well, all lawyers do this. And then all of a sudden, it becomes critically important. And frankly, if you look at all the leases, it's going to be that clause may be subject to quite a bit of litigation because you're either responsible under the contract or you're not. And I can tell you this: every contract that I review now includes the word pandemic in a force majeure clause, and they didn't always do that. So what I'd say to your listeners is, to the extent that they have a contract and they say, golly gee whiz, that's great, I've got a force majeure clause. Well, that's great, but have an attorney look at it, because I can tell you, whichever side you're on, whether you're the landlord or the tenant, and frankly, I'm talking from the tenant side. If I say, great, I have a force majeure clause, I can tell you that landlord's attorney is going to look at it very carefully. And again, we've been on both sides of that issue, and the force majeure clause have been greatly improved this year. So sadly to say, again, I'm going to push your listener towards an attorney before they decide to take a position, because we're looking at those provisions very, very carefully.
And what other, I'm sure like a couple of years ago, nobody would have thought, yeah, I'm going to put pandemic specific language into my contract. But what other sort of just bizarre one-off things are people thinking about now?
Brandon, as I sit here, I'm not going to give you a satisfactory answer
Okay.
because there's been so many. But so let me answer your question like this. I've written a few articles since COVID, and attorneys, unless you're doing title work, which I hate, is boring, but unless you're doing title work, reviewing a title of a piece of property, most of the time what we're looking at, it's kind of like a physician. You don't know exactly. You do the best you can and you contract as best you can, but there's always an issue. And for the first time ever, I was able to put a sentence in a legal article that I wrote that I knew for a fact was true. And what I said was, and this was, just a few months ago, I said, on this issue, I can say with certainty, I have the very same level of experience as every other attorney in the state of Texas. That is none. I mean, there were so many issues that came so quickly. In the corporate world, for instance, I had a client that a $2 billion client who needed to elect directors. And the bylaws said the only way they could elect directors was to call a shareholders meeting. And these shareholders would have had to come from 9 states and to elect the directors. Well, this was like April or May. And there's no way we could do that. And so you have to, but you have the chairman of the board and the president of the company calling you saying, what do we do? And you've got to find a way to make it happen. So there are so many novel issues, and part of it is you've just got to you've got to be creative, and you've got to think through things quickly. But to answer your question more directly, I think the force majeure has been the most looked at. The other thing in the lease arena is I'd say it's more business than legal. Whether you're representing the landlord or the tenants, you need to think carefully about what's in the best interest of your business right now. Landlord, should you force enforce your terms? Is that's what's in your best interest? Because if you do that, who's going to come in and be a tenant? What's in your best interest? If you're a tenant, I'd say, we've had lots of legislation that's helped the tenant. We've not had any legislation that's helped the landlord, and that's going to become very problematic. I served as a director for a bank until very recently, and we have a lot of land loans, and they've got to make their land payments, and so there's a lot. I'd say this: there's probably more business issues than there are legal issues, but you need to work carefully to look at your agreements.
This isn't necessarily investment advice and all of that, but do you foresee, or do your clients foresee, are they concerned with a potential crash of any sort as a result of all these eviction moratoriums? Because I know that, to your point, there's been scarce legislation to really help the landlords, but they still have to carry these loans. And yes, there's like forbearance agreements and all of that that extend the payments, but usually the payments are still due. But if the tenants haven't been paying all that time, what are the odds of actually collecting on all of that, like on that accounts receivable? So do you foresee, or have your clients foresaw any potential crashes pending?
I have not really seen that with my clients. I can tell you, just as a real estate attorney and an American, I'm terribly concerned about that. I own rental houses, and fortunately, I've not seen that issue. But it's a tremendous problem, because when these come due, a tenant who has just I remember being a law student going check to check. You have a hard time making one monthly payment. You get 5 or 6 piled up, it's a problem. And let me tell you, it's the I would say the great majority of landlords have payments on the other side. So it's not that the landlords are evil. They've got to have the ability to pay their mortgage. So I've got to think that there's going to be some type of legislation that will provide some assistance to landlords. I'll tell you that at this point, I haven't seen it. And I will further tell you that on the banking side, although the regulators at first were indicating some pretty suggesting that we, as directors and officers of banks, that we be pretty aggressive in working with our borrowers. I'm not sure that that's going to play out like we wanted it to as things go on. So I think there's got to be some type of legislative relief that will help the landlord.
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be something, because I can only imagine that, from just what I've seen, and while some people have been unaffected and their investments have been fine, people have been paying, but there's definitely places that haven't, and I'm just concerned that at some point it all gets backed up and there's some kind of, barring some kind of legislation, there's going to be some kind of ramifications of that. But kind of switching gears again just a little bit. Is there any like interesting developments specifically in Texas that you're seeing? We might have already discussed this, but is there any specific developments in Texas that you think are interesting and worth noting for real estate investors?
I would say come to Texas and invest in real estate is what I'd say. It is. I've never seen anything like it, and specifically for Austin, there's going to be a bubble, but that bubble may be 20 years out. I don't know. It's hot as it can be, and I had a new client from that builds. He's involved in both residential and commercial, and he relocated here from San Diego. And what he said was, Austin is San Diego 20 years ago. And one of his partners is an expert in apartment buildings. And there was an article in the American Statesman one time that talked about the glut of apartments. And what this specific client said is that may be true today, but it's not going to be true 6 months from today or a year from today. And so the market is as hot, except for office leasing, which is a problem. For some retail, but homes and some commercial property, and it's just, I've never seen anything like it. But you asked for some advice. Let me give you a couple things that I think are important. Stay in your lane. If you've done apartments, do apartments. I think that sometimes when my clients have got in trouble is when they've not stayed in their lane. If you're going to get out of your lane, study it carefully. Secondly, I'd say know your banker. If you don't have a great relationship with a banker, go make one. That's one person that you ought to have lunch with every couple of times, even during COVID. Every couple of months, you need to be in touch with your banker. So those are specific issues that are more business issues and practical than legal.
No, agreed. No, that's fantastic advice. And, we've seen this all the time in the investment space. At least I have on the investment side. People get shiny object syndrome and try to stretch themselves too thin, exploring too many opportunities at once. And I've seen investors burn out from that. And I'm just glad that I wasn't one of their investors, but it's okay. We've talked a lot about legal stuff. We talked about a lot of investment stuff, and this is the Real Estate CPA podcast, and everybody who's listening already knows what's coming. We do have to touch on the tax side just a little bit. With all your experience working with clients, have you ever, what tax strategies do you see them using, if any, and if so, what are they?
And I'm going to punt this. I'm going to say that I say, who's your CPA? And fortunately or unfortunately, I've been at this long enough to know that I know a bunch, but I hope the CPA is not making legal decisions. So I could say some things, but I think I'd be leading your listeners in the wrong direction if I did. I think it's very important to have a team. And the team for my clients are hopefully, well, number one, they're successful, and they did that without me most of the time. And then number two, the two people that I think are primarily important, probably don't let my wife hear me say this, but they're CPA, because that is a daily issue. And then after that is their attorney. And so I try very diligently to stay in my lane, and it doesn't mean I won't question the CPA if I've seen the issue before. And there have been times I've disagreed with a CPA and have suggested that the client get a second opinion. But most of the time I will defer to the CPA on tax issues. And so I'm not going to do anything differently here on this podcast.
Johnny, your non-answer is very on brand with the stay in your lane. So I like it. Well, we'll let you slide on that one. We'll let you slide on that one.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I gotta say, for all the times, John, you had mentioned earlier on the podcast, like, not to sound self-serving. That's legitimately good advice. Look, when you're doing entity structuring, and I've seen this before working with clients, you do want to work with an attorney. Yes, there's LegalZoom. Yes, there's File, INC, and there's all these little tools, and there's certainly options available to you. But I've seen it's better to do things right when it comes to this area the first time, rather than it is to go it yourself and either screw something up and get sued down the line, or just cause a big mess that needs to be untied later, like a really bad tied shoe that you have to untangle the knot. It's never really a good experience. So build your team, like John had said. Make sure you have the right people on your team to do the right jobs, and then there you have it.
Yeah, Johnny, I will say this. I think that one thing that attorneys have done wrong through the years is, in most businesses, the businessmen or women have been very successful before we came on, and their formula that they use for that success is maybe this long. Legal is this long, and so we need to make sure that the dog's not wagging, or the tail's not wagging the dog. But yeah,
and for our audio listeners, the long that Johnny was just referring to was large, and then the legal piece was a small piece of that. So
yes, thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. And I've got another question for you, kind of along those lines, and kind of also going back to my original, like, how do you know if you've got an attorney that knows what they're talking about? What's like maybe one or two questions that somebody can ask an attorney as they're going through the interviewing stage to try to figure out who should I work with? What are a couple questions that people should potentially ask a real estate attorney to figure out if the attorney has the appropriate amount of experience? And I'll give you some background. People ask me this all the time. What should I ask a CPA when I'm interviewing them to make sure that they have proper experience? I'm like, I have no idea, because if you ask them if you have real estate investor clients, I'm going to say, sure.
Right.
So what do you suggest that people ask to try to dive into the experience piece a little bit?
Well, let me answer it this way. When I putting my what I call a resume, or what discusses who I am, I like to put examples of what I've done. It's really easy for me to say I'm an experienced attorney. It's really easy for me to send softball transactions like that. But the more difficult question is, have you worked on the purchase of a quarter section of property in downtown Austin? Yes or no? Have you worked on the purchase of an apartment complex? Yes or no? Because have you worked on the sale of a confined feeding operation? Yes or no? And if you probably will, for instance, I think it was Thomas that you own some apartment complexes. And so it's so important to have those agreements where you see that the leases are good, and the waiver of, I've forgotten what it's called. I'm thinking waiver of subrogation, but that's something I'm working on today. But it's those waiver provisions where the tenant says, the lease is good. So I'd say, Brandon, that to the extent that you can ask them a little bit about the type of transaction that you're working on. And the other thing I wouldn't be afraid to do is is call a couple of attorneys in that community and talk to both of them, and perhaps to ask them about the other attorney. And I've done both of those things.
Over time, I've thought more and more about this sort of dilemma of how do you get good answers or trustworthy answers when you're interviewing any sort of service professional, whether it's an attorney or CPA or whoever. How do you get past the implicit, I'll say, bias that the service provider might have to feed you something just to win your business? And I think a lot about interviews, like employer interviews.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about how interviews have changed over time, they've gone away. I mean, there's some experience, but it's very behavioral, right? Tell me about a time when. And I think that's a really good way to interview service providers too. Tell me about a time when you worked with somebody like me.
Right.
What are some things that I should be aware of? And you're not necessarily looking for free advice. And if you ask me that, I'm definitely not going to give you free advice, but I might tell you, well, at your stage with one single family rental and based on our 200 other clients that have also passed this stage, your primary concern is making sure that your asset protection is set up and in place, and then starting to plan for how you can potentially become a real estate professional a couple years down the line. And until we become a real estate professional, we want to try to get the passive losses from your acquisitions to offset passive income. So the question is, how do we create passive income? Now, if you ask me that, I might tell you something like that. And then you go ask another CPA who might not have that experience, and they'll go, well, we'll talk about some tax deductions and we'll do your tax returns, and that's pretty much it. Right. And now to your point, Johnny, if you're interviewing multiple people and you're kind of asking them those behavioral questions, tell me about a time when you did this. Tell me about a time when you worked with somebody like me. I think you can start getting a lot more out of people. And again, you're not looking for free advice, and you need to make it clear you're not looking for free advice, but you're looking for somebody to tell you, I have so much experience here that I can rattle off the roadmap, the high level roadmap for you right here in 10 seconds because I have so much experience. Now, your situation might not exactly align there, but that's what we're going to be watching out for. And the same thing can be said, we work with a lot of syndicates, a lot of these guys that are going out and they're buying the big apartment complexes and they're putting the deals together. So they'll come to us and be like, okay, yeah, like what do I need a CPA for? I'm like, well, the attorney's going to put your operating agreement together, but before you sign it, I need to review it because I have to review the tax attributes, the profit loss allocations, distribution allocations, what happens when the entity liquidates. What if we do a zero liquidation? What if we liquidate at book value? And then they're going, okay, well, I've heard enough. Sounds like I do need to use a CPA as part of this process. So I think you just need to ask at least. I used to say like, ask them how many real estate clients they have and if they invest in real estate too. But then I realized, like, not to say that anybody would lie, but they could lie. So ask them to tell a story instead. And I think it's a lot harder to do.
Oh, I agree. And frankly, if that attorney or that CPA is unwilling to answer your question, just say no, because frankly, it's an honor as a service provider when someone considers hiring us. And so we need to recognize that and make sure it's a good fit for them, because if it's not, it's certainly not going to be a good fit for us.
100%. Couldn't agree more. It's definitely a two-way street whenever you're working in any type of professional relationship, or probably any relationship really where there's two or more parties.
Right.
So, I know we're coming up here to the end. We're almost at time here, and just want to see, if our listeners, listen to the podcast, they want to learn more about you, they maybe want to work with you. Maybe they're Texas investors. We have a ton of investors who do invest in Texas, and it is a very hot market right now. What would be the best way for them to do that?
Well, Johnny, Johnnny Merritt, Merritt, and I'll say that again because typically when I'm trying to write down a phone number, I never find the pencil till after they've said it and I'm too late. But Johnny Merritt, Johnnny Merritt, Merritt.com. And that will bring them to a website that introduces me and says what I do, and would love to visit with your investors. I'm honored that you guys have spent this time with me, and I learned a bunch from preparing for this time with you, and listening to what you guys had to say.
Absolutely. Glad we could provide value. It always feels good when someone says that. So we're gonna go ahead and drop that into the show notes for everybody who is listening. And John, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was an excellent episode. Really looking forward to putting it out there.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to today's show. If you enjoyed the show, please find us on iTunes and leave us a review. You can also email us at contact@therealestatecpa.com with any feedback or topic suggestions. We are always taking on new clients, and with the new tax laws in play, you really don't want to navigate this alone. Let us help you save money on taxes and with your accounting and CFO needs. To become a client, navigate to our client page at therealestatecpa.com and fill out a web form with as much detail about your situation as possible. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.